Well, good morning, it's Mr. Sorensen, and the machine of the day for today is the oscillating spindle sander. Well, the spindle sander is one of those machines that really is hard to do without, although it's not really one of those machines in the limelight. You don't know about it, you don't even know it's in the shop until the moment that you need it, and then there is no other tool to take its place. You're in trouble if you don't have a spindle sander. And the reason is because the spindle sander is really the only tool that can sand the inside of a radius, the inside of a curve. So quite often in a project you're going to create a curve, but how do you sand the inside of a curve? Now there are other sanders. Behind me is a disc sander. That disc sander and all the other sanders can sand the outside of a curve really well, but unless you have sandpaper in the shape of a spindle like this, in the shape of a cylinder, you can't possibly sand very easily the inside of a curve, except maybe by hand, right, with hand sandpaper, and that's going to take forever, and it's going to be really hard to get it perfectly smooth. On the other hand, with a spindle sander, it can make that work go just like that. So today we're going to look at this tool and just see the workings of it and how we can operate it. The first thing we want to take a note of is the fact that these are changeable spindles. So the spindle that is currently in the spindle sander is not the only one that we have. Let's take a look at the different sizes that we have. If I look down on the side of the machine down here, I see a lot of spindles. There's 3 on this side that can be interchanged, and on this side there's a bunch more. So we have a total of about 9 spindles that could all be used in the spindle sander. So we end up with about 9 different spindles that can be put into the spindle sander. To do that, we're going to need to choose the spindle that is the right spindle for the job. Now, how do I choose the right spindle for the job? Well, in our safety test, we talk about the fact that you want to choose the biggest spindle possible that will fit in your curve. The biggest spindle possible that will fit in your curve. Now, we got a lot of small ones and there's a bunch of big ones. Here's the smallest one, right? So here's the smallest spindle that we work with. That's about a 1/4 inch spindle. Here we've got a spindle around 1 inch. And our biggest spindle that's up in the machine right now is about 3 to 3.5 inches. So there's a lot of variety. You want to pick the biggest spindle that will fit in the piece of wood that you're sanding. Now the next thing you're going to need are these 2 wrenches, because to change that spindle up there we have to loosen the spindle lock nuts, and we have to take that spindle out and screw the next spindle in, right? If you notice that on the bottom of each of the spindles there's a threaded piece, and that's going to screw into the collet which is inside the machine. So that's going to require the wrenches here for these bolts. And then the last thing that's over here that we're going to have to do some work with is these throat plates, right? So we've looked at machines. When we make a hole in the tabletop for the blade or the sandpaper or the bit to go into, after that bit is changed, we have to close that hole back up. And so the same is true on a spindle sander. There's 3 throat plates here that are going to have to be checked. Once I pick the spindle that I need to work with, then I have to pick the throat plate that best closes up the hole around this spindle. Now we're looking in here underneath the spindle sander table. And behind me here you can see, here's the collet that these spindles are going to fit into. The threads fit down in here. This is also where we have to put the wrenches to loosen up the spindle and get the spindle off the machine. So that loosened it up a little bit. All right, that loosened it. So now I'll grab the collet by hand and I'll spin the spindle the rest of the way by hand and take that spindle out. And there's the 3.5 to 4 inch spindle that we can sand with. Now another thing to note is that you can see the change in color here. Here's the dark red sandpaper. The rest of it is highly colored. That's sawdust. Sawdust that is collected on here from the heat created by the friction of sanding and the sap in the wood. So at this point we're starting to lose the ability of this sandpaper to do the work. It's about through, its life is about over, and it's about time to throw that sandpaper away and get a new sanding sleeve to go on this spindle. All right, so here's the next spindle. The 1 inch spindle is the one we're going to put in there. So I'm going to reach that up here, put it in, and all I'm going to do is tighten the spindles hand tight. I don't need to tighten them with the wrenches. Hand tight. They will tighten up as they start sanding, and eventually to get it off I'm probably going to have to use the wrench. So I don't use wrenches to tighten them on there. Now the next thing I need to do is let's go back and look at the throat plates. Well, I'm through with my wrenches. Now I need to pick up my throat plates here, and you can see that the throat plates all have a very different size hole in them. And so I'm going to have to choose the throat plate here, which one of the throat plates has the hole that is the closest to the size of the spindle that I just put up there. So let's go on up and take a look at that. Now it's critical that this hole gets closed up on really any machine, right? Once I put this in there, if I start working and my hands get down in there, they are going to get destroyed down in this opening. So this, for safety, this has to all be closed back up. But I want to pick the throat plate that makes the smallest opening around that sandpaper. So this is not the best one. That one's definitely better, but I still have another small one. So I'm going to check that. Again, I want to find the smallest throat plate for the spindle. That one fits. That's a better way to go. Now this throat plate has a little notch right here in it, and the table has a little pin that the notch fits over. That's going to help keep the throat plate from vibrating and spinning and working its way free. If the throat plate worked its way free and got caught up on the spindle, it's going to spin around and get thrown off of here. So I will bring that around, put it on there like that, and fit it down on the table. Now the table's flat and we've filled up that hole so that my hands and the piece of wood I'm going to be working with cannot fall inside there. I can put the other throat plates back on the machine. So there's my setup. That's really the main setup. And oftentimes, if I'm sanding similar products to what other people are sanding, or if I'm sanding the same product over a long period of time, I may come up to the spindle sander and not need to change it at all. But I always want to double check. Anytime I bring a piece of wood to sand, I'm going to always double check, am I picking the biggest spindle for the curve that I am cutting? Now, another thing to note is that I'm not going to sand flat material or straight material on the spindle sander. The spindle sander has a very specific job. It sands curves really well. The spindle sander does not sand flat work very well. We're not going to sand flat material on a spindle sander. So we just need to remember, any flat material that needs to be sanded, we need to go find a belt sander or a disc sander for that. But we're going to leave the straight material, the flat material, for other sanders. The only thing we're going to sand on this spindle sander is material that has an inside curve. An inside curve. So here's another little thing that the spindle sander can do. Underneath here is a trunnion, just like we have on a bandsaw. If I loosen the handles here, the table of the spindle sander will tilt. Now there is a quick stop in here so that it can go back to 90 and stop, and that needs to be adjusted so that every time you put it back up and tighten it, you're at 90 degrees. But it does give me the ability to tilt it like this to whatever degrees I might need to sand my project. Now, this is quite unusual. Let me show you a project where we've used it, but it's a highly unusual thing that I have an inside curve plus a bevel on it, which is what I would be doing here if I were to set the table like this and sand. Now we're looking in here at the back of the spindle sander, and once again, kind of last but not least, in fact it might be up closer to the top of the parts that are really important on a spindle sander, is right here. We have the dust port, and just like the drum sander or any of the sanders that we look at here in the wood shop, for a sander the dust collection is not optional. All of these sanders are going to make an enormous cloud of dust that we're going to have to stand in and breathe if we don't somehow suck that sawdust out of the classroom right at the moment that the saw or the sander is making it. So it's always important to take your dust collector on a spindle sander and hook it directly into some sort of vacuum to pull all that sawdust away from the machine as you are working. Right here on the front of our Bailey spindle sander, about knee high, is the on and off switch. Now this is a great on and off switch, and in many cases you can upgrade your saw or sander to a switch like this because it's just a great safety feature. You've got a on switch which is kind of difficult to hit. That's what you want. You don't want to accidentally hit a saw and have the saw turn on. You don't want to accidentally hit a sander and have the sandpaper start moving. So the on switch is buried down in there where you have to touch it purposefully. There's no other way to do it. You can't accidentally get into the on switch. However, the switch that you can accidentally get into is the off switch, because they've put a big giant paddle right there at your knee level, so that if you sense anything going awry, all you got to do is move your leg a little bit and the saw is going to immediately shut off. So this is a terrific modern improvement to most machines. Back when I was in high school, very few machines had this kind of setup. I don't remember exactly, but I can't remember any of them having this kind of a setup. It was a on and off switch that were both kind of on the front there. Most of them just protruded out a little bit and you had to touch it, but you could also accidentally turn it on, trying to turn it off. In most cases, on most on and off switches, if you had your hand that was getting sanded or something like that, trying to reach down and with the presence of your wits about you, reach over and push a little off button, that doesn't sound very likely to me. If you're in the midst of having your hand sanded or your hand cut or your hair grabbed by a machine, you're far more likely to just be able to move your leg a little bit and maybe accidentally bump that off switch. So this is a great way to go. I would really recommend it on any machine you purchase and or have it upgraded so that it has this kind of setup, because this is a fabulous setup for safety's sake. Well, another really interesting feature about a spindle sander is that it's one of the few machines in a shop that I know of that actually has oil in it. So you can see right here on the back of the machine, right up here, there is a little window. And that little window lets me look in there and view the oil level, because a spindle sander needs an oil change, right? You have a very similar setup or design to what a car might go through. You have this spinning spindle set in some metal pieces, and so it has to have something to keep it cooled off. So a spindle sander will often have oil in here, and there's a window that I can look at to see if this thing needs an oil change. Every 2,000 miles, I got to take it in to Jiffy Lube and get the oil changed. So right here on the trunnion, on the right side of the machine, you can see we've got a protractor, right? And we've got our arrow, so we can set accurately the tilt of the table to anywhere from flat to 45 degrees. I'd like to show you now what it would look like to use the spindle sander to actually do some work. So it always starts at a bandsaw because the primary tool that comes right before the spindle sander is the bandsaw, because we're cutting a curve, right? The spindle sander is only used on inside curves. So I have a project that I'm working on, and that project requires a curve. I start here at the bandsaw. There's my cut. Now remember, the bandsaw is the only machine, or one of maybe two machines in the shop, that allow me to cut freehand, which is what you just saw me do. So when I get here to the machine, the first thing I'm going to do is I start by looking at my curve, and I find the biggest spindle possible for this curve. This is not it. So I got to take this spindle out. Sometimes I can do that by hand. Other times I'm going to pop the throat plate out. I'm going to grab the wrenches that we looked at earlier, and I'm going to come in here. I'm going to loosen it up in here where the collet is, and then I'll take that out. And anytime I take a spindle out, I want to put it right back on the rack so I know right where all these spindles are when I need them. Next, I'm going to take my piece of wood. I'm just going to start looking at the different spindles. And sure enough, the biggest spindle that we have here is the correct one. The biggest spindle that will fit in the curve. I'm going to put that spindle into the spindle sander and then just make it hand tight. Now I'm going to take my throat plate, put it back over here on the holder. The next thing I need to remember is that anytime I use a spindle sander, I always want to sand against the rotation of the sandpaper. Now, why is that? Well, there's only two ways to go. I can go against the rotation or with the rotation. Now, if I'm sanding with the rotation like this, and all of a sudden I lose control and the board gets pulled forward, going with the sander is going to pull my hands into the sandpaper as the board shoots off across the table. And that might sand up my hand. On the other hand, if I'm over here and I'm pushing against the rotation, that means the sander is pushing back towards me. If I were to lose control of this board and it got out of my hands, it's going to push me and my hands back out of the way. So I always sand against the rotation of the sandpaper. Also, it just happens that it sands better that way as well. So it's a better way to sand, and it's a far safer way to sand. Now, on our sander here, I noticed that on the top of the table, there's an arrow drawn in black Sharpie that just reminds me I'm going to go that way. I'm going to go to the left on this sander. Now, another manufacturer, another wood shop, you may have the sander spinning in the other direction, and then you have to go the other direction. You have to always look and find what direction is the spindle itself turning. Well, I'm ready to sand. I have everything set correctly, so here goes. This is called an oscillating spindle sander. Oscillating means that as I sand here, you're going to notice the sandpaper is moving up and down. Again, just like we've talked about, we talked about this with a joiner. If I run a board over the same knife in the same position 150 times, I'm going to wear the knife out in that spot. Same thing is true on sandpaper. Most sanders that oscillate or move up and down while you're sanding, they're doing it because they want to spread the sanding over a larger part of the sandpaper. Now, as I'm sanding here, I generally need a pencil line so that I can sand right to basically a stop sign. If I don't have a pencil line, I don't know where to sand to. Yes, I want to make sure it's smooth, but is it where I want it to go or is it not? Is it where it's supposed to go? Does it fit into the project it's supposed to fit into, or does it not? I really wouldn't know that unless I have a pencil line. So generally I'm going to be sanding to a pencil line. Now, even though it's sandpaper, I still want to keep my fingers away from it. And also notice with this big sandpaper, there's no throat plate. With this big cylinder, no throat plate. So I still have a pretty big opening right there that my hand could go down into if I'm not careful. So I really want to be very careful and respectful of this machine while I work with it, because there's a lot of things that could go wrong. Now, when I use a spindle sander or any sander, I never want to stop moving my board while I'm in contact with that spindle. If I come to a stop for a second like that, notice what's happening, right? That's going to sand a big groove into the edge of the board that I wasn't really planning on. Okay, so I can see right there. Now there's a big dip right there where I paused for too long. So when I use a spindle sander, I never stop moving unless I first pull the board away from the spindle. Then I can stop, back up, start again. Now again, I'm going to focus my sanding right here. I'll focus my sanding right here on the inside of the curve, this outside curve, and this outside curve here. I'm going to take those to a different sander to complete. Now, another potential safety problem with a spindle sander could be that I can sand the inside of a circle, which means now I'm going to set the entire piece down over the top of this spindle. One problem that can happen, if for some reason as I'm trying to sand that circle, things go wrong and I let go of that piece of wood, now that piece of wood will start spinning around like that, around and around and around on the spindle sander. Every time the spindle moves up, the piece of wood is going to move up. When the spindle moves down, oftentimes the spindle does not go down. So what that tells me is that eventually, after about 3 or 4 times going up and down, that circle, that piece of wood that's in a circular shape spinning around on the top of the spindle, is going to come launching off of the spindle sander. So in that case, if anything ever goes wrong, my first thing that I do is I back away, and my second thing, as fast as I can, I want to hit that off switch so that if there was a ring on here spinning around, it wouldn't get airborne and launch off across the class. I'd probably want to shout if that happened. As I was backing away and reaching, I would want to say, "Hey!" and try to get people's attention so other people around who it might hit would notice that we got a problem here. If I'm doing everything correctly, if I'm working safely and conscientiously, it's likely or unlikely that that would happen. Now, another really dangerous part of machines like this that spin, especially if you have long hair, and right, I'm over 6 feet tall, so my hair, although there is none there at this point, even when my hair was there and longer, my hair was still a further distance from this machine than many of you. One of the issues on spinning machines is that they can catch your long hair. So a safety rule in any shop is that if you have long hair, you really need to wear it in a hairnet to keep it back and constrained, so there's just no way, kind of like me, right? There's just no way my hair is going to get caught up in a machine. It's not a safety risk for me. If you have long hair, you have to make it not a safety risk for you. And you do that by putting it in a hairnet and somehow maybe in a scrunchie and somehow getting it constrained. Ponytails are not acceptable because a ponytail still puts all that hair and it's hanging way down here and it could get caught up in the machine. So long hair is a big safety concern on a machine like the spindle sander. We would want to make sure your hair was addressed, taken care of, and there's no way it could get into the machine before you ever started to use it. And then like all other machines, right, safety glasses are always a must because pieces of wood and certainly sawdust could get in your eyes as you use the spindle sander. So I hope you've enjoyed looking at the ins and outs of this spindle sander. Not a very complicated machine, not necessarily even a very dangerous machine, but definitely a machine that if we use it well, it will be a great asset to any wood shop. When you have to sand the inside of a curve or the inside of a circle, there is just no way to do it easily without a spindle sander.